Welcome to WARBIRD Radio Downunder. I'm your host, Dave Homewood, and I'm with my co-host, Grant McKieran. Hi, Grant.
Hey, how you going, Dave?
Good, good. Today on the show, we've got Matt Henderson. How you going, Matt?
Oh, I'm well, thanks, guys. Thanks for having me on.
It's a pleasure. And of course, Matt, you are probably famous these days, associated with Tocumwal. Is it Tocumwal or is it Tocumwal?
No, it's Tocumwal, unless you're a GPS, in which case then it's Tocumwal.
Yes, or me saying it for the first time when I was starting playing Crazy Down Under, much to Steve Vish's delight.
Every GPS that I know calls it Tocumwal, in the same way that it calls Geraldry.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, I mean, it's one of those foreign languages to me, so it's
what English?
Wow.
Nice. Touche.
Most of us just call it Toke. We're going up to Toke.
It is, yeah. Toke, Denny, and any of those shortened names. It's keeps it simple.
Okay, well, Matt is from the Tocumwal Aviation Museum. Can you tell me? We caught up in 2015, and you were had your aircraft at Kyneton at that stage. How long have you been at Toke?
So we moved to Tocumwal at the end of 2017. So
Right.
I think the last time we spoke, I still had the CT4.
Right. Yes. Yeah, you took me for a ride in it.
Yeah, and about that same time, the council up here, which is the Berrigan Shire, had released land on the airport to sort of do an airpark thing like at Temora and that. And we bought one of the blocks just opportunistically, not thinking about what we'd do with it in the future, but it seemed like a good idea at the time. And so we bought the land, and I didn't really think about it for a little while, thinking that maybe one day when we retire we'll move up here. And then not too long later, we sort of made the decision to sort of escape the world and pack up and move up here. So we sold up everything at Kyneton. Kaz and I were both working remotely at the time, so it didn't really matter where we were. And we packed up stumps and moved up here, and with no plans other than to just live up here and build a hangar and a house and sort of enjoy the life up here.
So how did that lead into you ended up creating the museum there?
The museum story was kind of funny. It was it kind of almost started as a joke at the Aero Club one night with all the old boys sitting around drinking. Some of them not so old, but that's how the story goes.
Yeah.
And when we first moved here, we sort of had a bit of an idea about the history here, through some of the events that we'd run here with the Antigas and the Air Force pilgrimage back in 2011. Prior to that, I'd never even heard of Tocumwal or knew why it was significant or relevant to anything. And when we moved here, I sort of started getting myself buried in the history here, because I was sort of surprised and amazed by it all, by how much went on here and how little I knew of it or other people seemed to know about it. And there was a museum type thing that existed prior to us creating this. Anyone that's sort of come to Tocumwal over the years and had been a part of a flying activity would have heard an old fellow by the name of Bob Brown give a talk, and he had a collection of photos up in that kind of got moved from pillar to post around town, and it never really had a home. And one night, we were sitting around at the Aero Club having a few beers, and I was sort of lamenting, not having a proper museum here, and someone sort of just saying, well, someone should do something about, a proper museum here, and I just said, oh, okay, well, I'll do it, which is generally how I've dobbed myself into everything that I've done in my life, which is to say you'll do it and then figure it out later on. But in my mind, I'd sort of, with my involvement that I'd had with the Air Force Museum at Point Cook and the time that I'd spent at Temora over the years, as well as obviously travelling around the countryside and the world looking at aviation museums, I kind of had this idea of, what I thought was possible at a small scale. And so I sort of thumbed a bit of a plan together and a bit of a design and a layout, and came up with some ideas about, how we might go about doing it. And I knew that the council here was also trying to do something. Like they wanted something here, but they just didn't really know what to do, or how to go about doing it. So they did what all councils do, which is to go and pay a consultant to tell them what to do. And all of that was kind of happening in parallel. So the council had paid a consultant to write a report on, what council could do with the history here and what that might look like. And at the same time, I was sort of putting together a business plan and design and, some concepts about what might be possible. And had a meeting with the CEO of the council at the time and just went and had a coffee and, sort of talked through my business plan and the ideas that I had for what we wanted to do, mostly because I wanted to ask for some land to do it on at the airport. And he sort of pulls out a draft report that he had from his consultants and flicked to the last page and said, that's funny. These consultants said, that's basically what we should do, which is kind of like a micro museum or whatever they call them. So obviously, limited funding, but, able to start with something and sort of grow from there. And so, between, what the consultants had put together and what I'd put together, that was all sort of bundled together and went to a council meeting. And I went to the council meeting and had a bit of a talk about what we wanted to do and what we're after. And that went from, us, so Kaz and myself, quite happy to, build it and do it all ourselves and pay for it because I thought it was a viable, business venture, to the council wanting to partner with us and help fund it all, which I was kind of happy with. So it ended up as a partnership between ourselves and the council. They managed to secure some federal government funding to help build the structure, which was done to my design. And then Kaz and I fitted it out and sort of in amongst all of that happening, spending a lot of time researching, a lot of time in the archives, dredging up stuff that most they'd never been looked at before, which also kind of fascinated me that there was, a massive amount of information in the archives that no one had ever even looked at. So that was, another part of the process was making sure that, whatever we presented in here was, historically accurate and backed up with evidence. Seems pretty obvious from a museum, but since we'd been here, we'd heard a lot of tales, I'll call them, about the history here, and some of it just didn't gel with what I had researched and continue to research, and so there's a fair bit of almost myth busting going on with what we've done over the last couple of years in the research that we've done. Because again, no one had ever researched to that degree before, and everyone sort of just relied on, tales that have been told over the last, 70 or 80 years as being evidence of what happened here,
Right.
and most of which we've sort of proven to not actually be historically accurate. So.
Okay. Well, can you give us a potted history of what actually did happen? When was it established and what happened there?
So one of the things that interested me most was everything sort of focused on primarily Liberators and World War II. As we sort of uncovered, there was far more than just Liberators. And I was really curious as to the pre-war history here. Regional aviation in Australia was pretty interesting and exciting throughout the 1920s and 30s, as a lot of development, expansion, and exploration was going on,
Yeah.
and no one had ever talked about what happened here, pre-war, and so. Thanks to the wonderful people at Trove, who have digitized a heap of useful content, we uncovered all of this, amazing content about aviation here at Tocumwal, which actually dates back to 1921, when it became a regular aeroplane landing ground, as they called them back then.
Okay.
There was all of this fascinating history throughout the 1920s and 30s. We had an airline service that was established here in 1930. We had what today we would call adventure flights, happening in 1921 and 1922 very regularly. So, people who bought ex-military aeroplanes and were doing, barnstorming and joy flights in them. And then airline services into the early 1930s, and all of that was happening on the property which ultimately became the airbase during World War II. And so in January 1942, as I guess our government and the Americans were sort of starting to realise that a Japanese invasion, or at least a threat to our northern area was pretty likely. they'd started setting about looking at, where they needed to place defence infrastructure throughout Australia to support, primarily what became, American operations, because, the Royal Australian Air Force and our Army at the time weren't that significant that it needed much in the way of facilities. And the Americans, who were obviously shipping a lot of people and personnel and equipment and aircraft and all these other bits into Australia, needed places to operate from. And so Tocumwal was selected as a location for what was titled an aircraft maintenance and repair depot, but also just general stores. And it was significant in terms of size. It was like nothing that had ever been built almost anywhere in the world at that stage in terms of scale. So, and it was designed to cater for, aircraft assembly, so aircraft componentry that was being shipped into primarily Melbourne and Geelong, being, put on trains and sent up to Tocumwal and erected and then flown off into the operational areas. Aircraft that were damaged in operational areas up north, coming south to, I guess, a safer environment to get, repaired and maintained, plus just, general stores and training and other bits and pieces that went on. So the original design for the base was for personnel of about 5,500, and primarily for the US Army Air Corps.
That's huge. That's a huge number of people.
Yeah, massive. Yeah. It was, I think, 608 buildings was the original building plan.
Wow.
4 runways, taxiways, water infrastructure, sewer infrastructure, stormwater, because all of the land around here was just, grazing land primarily.
Yeah.
So there was nothing really significant here. The town itself only had about 400 people, so it was a pretty tiny town. But there was this plan drawn up, and the Americans designed it based on some of their learnings from Pearl Harbor about not congregating everything together in a small place. So having quite a sparse layout, and some elements of some bases in America that they sort of used as part of designing it all. But in the end, it ended up being nearly 6,500 acres of land, which fell within the boundary. Which was basically 6 kilometres from north to south and 5 kilometres from east to west. So it was a very significant area. And they basically said to War Cabinet at the time, or the Administrative Planning Committee, this is what we want built, this is where we want it built, get at it. And so, so the Australian government set about building this base for the Americans here at Tocumwal. And just simply because of the size and scale of what was required here, part of the establishment of the project here was the creation of the Civil Construction Corps and the Allied Works Council, who would become sort of the government bodies who would undertake major defence projects within Australia during World War II. And Tocumwal's air depot was the first major project that they worked on and were established for. And so the Civil Construction Corps, which was basically conscripted Australian labourers, were put to work, building things. Most of them weren't actual builders. They were just, guys who were too old for military service or not fit for medical service, or not in critical roles, were just conscripted into this labour corps. And initially, nearly 3,000 were sent here to Tocumwal to work on the project, along with, state government agencies for roads and railways and water and sewer infrastructure and all these other, and electricity. And local councils who had all of their equipment, taken off them, and all their personnel taken off them to come here and work on this project. Because the time frame was ambitious. The government had this list of about 21 or 22 priority projects to work on at this stage, and this was one of the major ones. And they were basically given 6 months to get all these projects done, which, in today's terms would mean, not achieving a great deal.
Yeah.
But, at that point in time, with obviously the impetus to get stuff done, and probably a significant lack of regulations, they just went and built stuff. There was a lot of, byproducts of what happened as quickly as it did. Mostly things weren't built very well, but they weren't designed to last forever. They were basically designed to last for a war that they thought would probably go on for 3 or 4 years.
Yep.
So as long as, so engineering standards were reduced because of all of that and all the rest of it. But ultimately within 6 months, they built this base.
That's pretty impressive.
Oh, it's unbelievable. Yeah. And one of the many things that we've discovered along the way while researching is both photographic and cinegraphic evidence of the construction here. Because the government was spending so much money on it, they'd been allocated £2 million to build this project, which was extraordinary at the time.
Yeah.
They wanted to, kind of PR it, but not too much. So the Department of Information actually contracted photographers and videographers to come here and film and what was going on, which we then finally uncovered a couple of years ago, along with a massive amount of aerial survey imagery that was done at the time. So from about April 1942 through to sort of the end of October 1942, we've got almost fortnightly or 3 weekly aerial survey imagery that was done in very high resolution and very well detailed, as well as ground-based photography and ground-based movies that were produced, including a documentary that was called the Tocumwal documentary, which is a film that runs for about 6 minutes, showing all of the construction activity here.
Wow, that's brilliant for your museum to be able to show people how it was built.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, it's because for me, it's like I'm a visual person. So as much as I like reading stuff, I'd rather look at pictures and movies. And as I've discovered, so do most punters who come through a museum. And so to be able to have imagery and videos that run in our cinema that capture all of that without really having to say too much is very powerful. Particularly, some of the imagery is very, very powerful in terms of the scale of what was going on, and particularly how things were done back then. With no things like health and safety regulations or any of that sort of stuff, or the fact that most things were done by hand because they didn't have the equipment that we have today.
It was almost the equivalent of a rural barn building.
Yeah, basically, yeah. And you look at some of the videos or the movie and all of the imagery of the large hangars getting built here, and it was just dozens and dozens and dozens of blokes and block and tackles and ropes, hoisting things. There was no cranes or any of this sort of stuff. And then, the hangars that they built here, 6 of them were significant. They were 100 meters long, 40 meters wide, 10 meters to the bottom of the rafters, basically an acre under cover, all made of timber, and all built by hand.
So no metal scaffold or anything like that?
No, nothing. And looking at the buildings today are still impressive. We've still got 3 of them that are standing, which is impressive.
How many were there originally, Matt?
So there were 6 of those that were built, and they were they were called named different things. So some were listed as erection hangars, which were basically designed for the assembly or erection of aircraft. So the idea was that aircraft would go into these big hangars, and they could fit. Well, when the RAAF took over later on, they ended up fitting four B-24s in these things. So it gives an idea of how big the hangars are.
Oh, yeah.
And we've got some photographs of US B-17s inside the hangars, making a B-17 look very small.
Right.
And so they're very significant. So 6 of them were built. One of them burnt down in the end of 44 during a maintenance incident. Another one burnt down in the late 90s. They mostly post-war stuff. They were used for storing. During the 60s and 70s and 80s, they were used for storing like hay and a lot of the crops that were grown around here. Hay has a pretty good thing of spontaneously combusting, which is not really good in a gigantic timber hangar. So one of them was lost to that, and another one just simply failed, like structurally failed in the late 60s and fell down. And again, the buildings were built, almost as an experiment. The original design for those hangars was an American design for a steel structure, and simply due to the lack of resources available at the time, they couldn't use steel. They couldn't get sufficient steel to build them out of steel. So some engineers, as part of the Allied Works Council, came up with a revised model using timber. And again, timber was a controlled building material at the time as well. And there wasn't a lot of it. And so a lot of the timber that ended up in the hangars was, very recently felled timber out of Gippsland, basically milled to the sizes required, sent to Tocumwal and put in the buildings. That wasn't seasoned or dried. And as a result, not long after they were built, coming into summer, they were all pretty wonky.
Right.
And they still are today. But the fact that three of them are still standing is testament to, the work done to build them in the first place.
Yeah.
How are they for asbestos? Because I know the
Covered in
hangar
it.
at Werribee, yeah, because the hangar at Werribee where the B-24 restoration project goes on, I mean that hangar is dominated by the B-24, and that's huge. So that gives a real perspective on how big the ones at Tocumwal are. But
Yeah.
Well,
they're full of asbestos, and how are you going about preservation?
So I mean, they were the same design. So the hangar design had two different variants. So it was basically the 96-foot span, which is the one that the B-24 Memorial is in. So it was a lower roof line and obviously only 96 foot wide. The ones that were all built here, well, there was two different versions here. We had a couple of the 96 foot versions built that were up on the northwestern side of the base. They're both gone as well. And the others were the 130-foot span ones. And so they're all still covered in asbestos because there's no real alternate to do, to re-roof these things, in a cost-effective manner. And the owners of those, they're all privately owned now. They two of them particularly are workplaces, so they undergo very regular atmospheric testing and other bits and pieces, and they've had work done to try and preserve the asbestos, like everyone who's got it, as much as possible. So they are in as good a condition as you can expect from an 80-year-old building that was designed to last 5 years.
Yeah.
That little detail.
Yeah, so that bit's all fascinating, and I think what was really interesting was I used to hear all these stories about there were 7,000 Americans here, and from all of the evidence that I'd sort of been through in terms of aerial imagery and other documents that we came across, there was nothing that suggested there was ever that many people here.
Right.
Like it's hard to hide 7,000 people.
Yeah.
And so as I managed to come across some documentation that was the US Army Air Corps or the US Army's. They had what they called a station list and a disposition of personnel, and effectively it was like a weekly report on what units were located where in Australia and how many bodies were in each unit. And so what was supposed to be a very significant base for the US Army never actually became one. At its peak, there was just under 1,000 US personnel here. And the war situation sort of contributed to that a fair bit. All of this was built with the expectation that the Japanese would just keep marching on south. But major battles like Coral Sea and Guadalcanal and stuff, which sort of stemmed all of that. And then after that, the Japanese sort of started to get pushed back further north. All of what was built here for the Americans became too far away for them. And there's some famous quotes about General Kenny basically saying, we're on a visit here, this is all very good, but move it 2,000 miles north because it's too far away from everything now.
Yeah.
And so very rapidly after that, the Americans stopped sending stuff here and started moving out, primarily up to Townsville, which is where the units that were initially based here at Tocumwal primarily ended all up at Townsville. Some ended up at Eagle Farm, but the majority at Townsville. So by sort of the start of May, American units sort of started moving in, and then by the end of September, they pretty well all left. And when there was some conferences that were held throughout October 42, which were really looking at what to do with this gigantic base that had been created and the money that's been spent on it. The Americans were like, well, we don't need it anymore, so we'll give it to the RAAF. And at that stage, there was about 120 American guys who were still here as part of a communications training unit, and they were gone not long after that, to the point when the RAAF took it over in early November 1942, there was basically nothing here. They did as all good things did, they did a handover and takeover of what was a government-owned facility being transferred to another one, and they, diligently documented everything that was in every building when the RAAF took it over, and there's about 900 pages of inventory, and basically it was empty buildings. There was not much in the way of anything that the Americans had left behind, other than some general stores in some of the storage areas. But all of the hangars were empty, all the other buildings were empty, and the Air Force, the Royal Australian Air Force, sort of wandered into this, gigantic abandoned base, wondering what to do with it all, because the Air Force at that stage wasn't that big either. And so there was a lot of discussion throughout sort of November as to what to put here. And they just sort of started picking up units from around Australia, as well as new units that were being developed, and then moving them here. And ultimately, by the middle of 45, there was nearly 5,500 Air Force personnel here, including over 500 women of the WAAF. This was both the largest Air Force base from a RAAF perspective, and also the largest of all of the WAAF bases that were operated. And then initially, the units that were here from an Air Force perspective was number 7 aircraft depot, so they're maintenance, repair, overhaul of anything that the Air Force was operating at the time, and they were a big unit in their own right. They were just over 2,100 personnel just in that one unit alone.
Wow.
The paratroop training unit, which had only just been established at Laverton, had moved up here, and they were the first Air Force flying operations that took place here.
Did you say paratroop?
Yeah.
I didn't realise the Aussies had them.
Yeah, they didn't use them anywhere.
Okay.
So the paratroop training unit was established at Laverton in very early November 42, and it was one of the first units that was picked up and moved up here, because Laverton was obviously pretty busy with the aircraft depot that was down there at the time.
Yeah.
And this was seen as an opportunity to get some flying operations up here at Tocumwal and make use of all the facilities that were here. And so they moved up here in the middle of November and started what was very new concepts for the Australian Army and the RAAF, because this had never been done before in Australia. So there were lots of trials done on parachutes and gear, on dummies. Initially, the aircraft that they were using was a DC-2, as well as a couple of de Havilland Dragons that had been modified for, which is a horrible thought, jumping out of a de Havilland Dragon. I wouldn't have thought it would have been big enough to get into with a parachute on, but
not a big door.
No. So there was a few Dragons that had been modified for paratrooping. And they also had a WWII that they used for filming a lot of the trials and stuff. Well, they were supposed to get a Tiger Moth, but that was the first aircraft that crashed at Tocumwal.
Wow.
It had been flown up from Laverton and then crashed on arrival by running into power lines that just happened to run across a major taxiway that ran between all of the hangars and the end of the runway up the northern end. And about a week later, a Spitfire came to exactly the same spot and hit exactly the same power lines and came to grief as well.
Wow.
So there's a good start to all of that. Thankfully, there was an aircraft depot there that could, the Tiger Moth got flying again. The Spitfire never did. In fact, the Tiger Moth's still flying today. It's up in Sydney.
All right.
Which is pretty cool. And the DC-2 that was here is the one that's in the WARBIRD Aviation Museum. Collection. So,
right.
That was the first Air Force aircraft that was ever stationed here at Tocumwal.
Interesting about the parachute. What the paratroop training unit wound up becoming the Army's parachute training school, because they moved out eventually and wound up getting disbanded at the end of World War II, but then reformed in the 50s. So we do actually have a para, the Air Force quite often flies a C-130 to Nowra, and they get a whole lot of Army guys and push them out the back.
Yep.
It used to be Caribous. But the other thing about Toke was after the war, wasn't it used for dismantling and scrapping a whole lot of aircraft?
Yeah, so Tocumwal became the largest of, so post-war, what were called the care and maintenance units, which were basically places to go and store stuff as the military demobbed, and just simply because of the amount of land that was here and the number of personnel who could keep aircraft somewhat serviceable or in various states of serviceability. Tocumwal just sort of got sent stuff as the home of B-24 training and the all the maintenance operations were here. The majority of all of the B-24 squadrons were sent here post-war, and all of their aircraft ended up just being stored here. But yeah, between 1940, sort of the end of 1945 through to the end of 1960, when the base closed in October, over 1,000 aircraft had been sent here for storage and ultimately disposal, most of which were scrapped. Some survived being scrapped, like the majority of our Mustangs flying around in Australia today were all saved from being scrapped here. But yeah, there's 31 different types within that 1,000 aircraft that had come to Tocumwal for disposal, and it included not only aircraft from World War II, but aircraft from both the Malayan Emergency and Korean War. In fact, there was a whole bunch of Mustangs that were manufactured by CAC, flown to Laverton for acceptance, flown to Tocumwal, put into storage. Some were then pulled out of storage in the sort of 1949, 1950, sent to Korea, did their thing in Korea, came back to Tocumwal to get scrapped. There were others that stayed in storage the entire time and basically got scrapped with their flying hours that were sent from going from Fisherman's Bend to Laverton to up here and then never done with anything again. So
Wow.
There's some serious horror stories about what went on up here. So.
Yeah. They're not still sitting in a hangar there, are they,
Matt? Yeah, unfortunately, no. There are no barn finds to be found. But I mean, there's a lot of aircraft that are, some very significant aircraft that are sort of floating around today that are, remnants of the operations here. The Moorabbin Museum's got quite a few airframes that were recovered from here in the sort of 60s. There are aircraft that are flying around today that have been restored using parts that were found in there was this the notorious dam or famous dam up here, which was sort of located near to where the scrappers were, where basically anything that wasn't able to be smelted was just chucked in this dam. And so there's parts, in aeroplanes in Australia that are flying that were found, in paddocks around here or on farms around here. There's a cool story that still seems unbelievable about the what is now the 100 Squadron Mustang on the 90th anniversary pilgrimage between Tocumwal and Ballarat, lost an exhaust stub, and at about the same time it was doing that trip, Dave Jones, who was the technical curator at the RAAF Museum, was showing some of the other museum staff around the dam where they used to, dig up bits, and he just happened to be kicking around in the dirt and kicked up a exhaust stub, and which just happened to be a Merlin exhaust stub. And BD, who was flying the Mustang at the time, rings up Jonesy and said, "Oh, I've landed at Ballarat, and we seem to have lost an exhaust stub." And he believed at the time that someone was pulling his leg because he's dug up this exhaust stub out of the ground up in Tocumwal. And as it turns out, that exhaust stub that was dug up by Jonesy's foot was a serviceable item. It was taken to Ballarat, cleaned up, and put on the aircraft, and it's still on that aircraft today.
Wow.
And which is a really cool story. But at the time, none of us believed it. We thought it was just it was like someone having a laugh. But it's a pretty cool story that we all sort of still remember very vividly.
But just for overseas listeners, what you guys in Australia call a dam is what we'd call a pond, isn't it?
So like a hole on a farm for collecting water.
Yeah.
And crap.
And surplus military junk. Yeah.
Right.
And surplus farm equipment and anything.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. It's or what most farmers use them for is digging great big holes and putting all of their rubbish in.
Yeah.
And because back in the old days you couldn't see anything from the ground, but these days you can very clearly from either flying around or having a gander on Google Earth how many rubbish tips exist on farms around the countryside.
Oh, mate, just even flying a hot air balloon at 1,000 feet out in the countryside and going, wow, this guy's got a huge collection of scrapped cars in his backyard.
Oh, there's heaps around here still. It's and there are still farms around here that have got piles of aeroplane bits on them.
Oh, really?
Yeah. There's there's in fact the amount of stuff that was surplus is fascinating around here. There's houses in town whose fences are built using aeroplane bits.
Okay.
A very common thing to do back then was the mosquito undercarriage legs where the rubber rebound things were. So those outer casings were very popular for welding end on end to make posts. And there's 3 houses in town whose fence posts are made out of mosquito leg bits.
Wow.
Wow.
There's an entire shed on the other side of town that's made out of WWII airframes that were just cut up, and they sort of made the structures of the side of the shed. Because that's back then, you think post-war there was this massive shortage of building materials and anything else like that.
Yeah.
Metal. Yep.
Yeah, and a lot of the particularly steel or stainless steel or magnesium and stuff that couldn't be smelted, because pretty much all of the smelting guys wanted was aluminium. Anything that wasn't really aluminium was just sort of cast aside, and farmers and anyone else who wanted it could just come and buy it for basically nothing.
Yeah.
So there's farm carts around here that I can identify that have got aircraft wheels on them. Pretty common to see farm carts with Mustang wheels or Wirraway wheels and that type of stuff on them.
Are you as the museum curator? Are you approaching these people and saying, "Hey, if you don't want that anymore, can we have it?" Sort of thing.
As you can imagine, it's a very delicate activity doing that sort of thing. So
Yeah.
I know a lot of people in the past, because there have been scavengers up here through the last decades looking for bits and pieces, and so we've sort of avoided doing that. But what we wanted to do was build a facility that was seen as a permanent structure and sort of get respected and trusted in the community. Because when we
Right.
moved here, we didn't know anybody. We were known to a couple of people when we moved here.
Yeah.
And so, as sort of blow-ins taken over the town's history, that was very delicate to sort of manage all of that.
True.
And so we sort of thought, okay, well, we'll build this so that if people do have stuff that they might be willing to to loan or gift or whatever, at least they know there is a permanent facility, and it is that we are respectable people and we are trustworthy with history and all of those types of things. So since we've opened, we've had a lot of that, where farmers will just come in with utes full of bits and pieces in the back of them, and they just unload them out the front and go, okay, you guys can have all of that. And I'm like, okay, thanks.
Where are we going to put that?
Yeah, that's some of it. Yeah, it's like, I'm not really sure what I'm going to do with that, but thanks. But at least they didn't throw it out.
Yeah.
And we've got some really good nuggets out of all that. We've got things that I generally can't identify, but I usually just take photos of and send to Matt Denning or Matt Grigg or other people that I know and go, can you tell me what this thing is? And normally, within a very short period of time, particularly if it's interesting, I'll get a response. But yeah, we've had bits of Liberator, bits of Wirraway, bits of Jet, bits of vampire jets, and other bits and pieces just sort of turn up, and a lot of people don't really understand what it is that they've got. One of my good mates in town here's got I'm not even sure, it's kind of like an armor plating bit out of the front of a single seat Vampire, which is just in front of, just behind where the wheel well was in the nose.
Yeah.
And he's got one of those behind his stove in his shed.
Okay.
Because it's really good at protecting stuff behind it from heat.
Yeah. Funny that.
But he had no idea what it was. And I was sitting there one night, we're just having a beer, and I'm looking at it going, pretty sure that's out of an aeroplane. He goes, I figured it was just because of the shape of it. And he goes, I've never been able to figure out what it was though. And so I took a photo of it and sent it to a couple of people. And shortly afterwards, I go, here's a breakdown diagram of the aeroplane, and that's that bit there. And I'm like, cool. At least we know what it is now.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's still behind his fireplace in his shed. But it's, at least we know where it is and what it is.
Yeah.
So he's got a bit of a different appreciation now for the thing that's in his shed. And he'll because he knows what it is, he'll make sure it's protected and preserved and not get thrown out or anything else like that. So
Right. Yeah.
um,
So the airport itself, nowadays, obviously there's the museum there and your activities, but is it still a regional airport like it was in the 30s, or what's happening
no,
there?
not at all. No, it's rather quiet. Probably the major activity that's been going on over here over the years is gliding
Mm-hmm.
which has been sort of the major thing here since about 1970.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's big.
When
You've
it became a
got Benalla down in Victoria, just north of Melbourne, and then Toke is the really big one in New South Wales.
Yeah, and Toke, the gliding operations here were established in sort of late 1970 by Bill Riley and Ingo Renner, who were travelling through Tocumwal on their way to or from delivering a glider somewhere, and had driven past the big hangars here, thinking that'd be a good place to to do something with gliders because it's big. And Bill had already started looking at importing gliders and other bits and pieces, and they ended up creating what became known as Sportavia, which was this big gliding hub. Bill basically imported and signed out just about every single glider that was imported into Australia throughout the 1970s, 80s, and 90s.
Okay.
So it became kind of the home for gliders getting born in Australia. But from a weather perspective, it was it's obviously very significant. Gliding weather around here, there's no airspace really to speak of. Get really good thermal activity during the summer months, and they can do some very impressive distances in gliders. I think a couple of guys out of here last year did over 1,000-kilometre trips,
Yeah.
which is astounding in a glider. But that's kind of that's been a big thing here, and predominantly their focus has always been on bringing international pilots into Australia. And so there's always been a big, Japanese and European base of operators who come here, during our summer and all stay here for 4 or 6 or 8 weeks and just go gliding every day because they can, and they can go distances that they can't do at home and operate, almost nowhere else like you can. So, so it's still a big gliding hub today. Sportavia, as it was, no longer exists. It sort of fell apart in the mid 2000s, but in the sort of 2015, 2016, about the same time that we moved here or bought here, that hangar was purchased by a fella we all know as Lumpy Patterson. His real name's Mark, but if you call him Mark, he'll ignore you. But Lumpy bought the hangar, and he'd never had anything to do with Tocumwal before, but obviously knew of Bill and Ingo. Ingo was a world-renowned gliding champion. He'd won everything that you could win from a gliding perspective, dozens of times over. And so Lumpy bought the hangar and the land around it, and sort of started getting it going again as a gliding hub. And then COVID hit, and that sort of killed all of that for a little while. But he's sort of got it going again. He's invested quite heavily in all of that. So gliding's a big thing here. Obviously, the airpark where we live is a bit of a thing now too. We've got about 28, 30 properties in there. There's quite a few of us now who live on the airfield full time, which is like I love it. It's that was kind of one of the things that drew me here was was the opportunity to own freehold land, on a very historic aerodrome that's generally pretty quiet. Like, whenever I go flying, there's not usually anyone else out and about. So it's kind of like having this massive, 1,800 acre airfield all to yourself, which is money almost can't buy that.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's somewhat surreal. Last night I was out flying around in the Windjill, and I was the only one flying. It was 20 minutes before sunset, and it was just magic. And it's like that every night. It's just sort of surreal to have this environment to operate in.
Brilliant. So what aircraft have you got in the museum?
So at the moment it's a bit of a moving feast, depending on who's got their aeroplanes in here from time to time. So as of today, there's a Dragon Rapide that belongs to Maurice Rolfe. So it's technically airworthy, but not currently maintained. I've got Doug Hamilton's series in here at the moment. We've had that in here for a little while.
Okay.
And there's a cool history. One of the things I wanted to do with the museum as much as possible was have aircraft in here that were at least airworthy, because that's kind of a thing I like. And also where we can have, where possible, have some relevance to here at Tocumwal, either a specific airframe or a type. and the Air Force operated Dragons, and basically all of the Dragon and repeat maintenance was done here at 7AD during the war. When we sort of created all this, Maurice's repeat was already here in another hangar, and we sort of asked him nicely if we could, borrow it and put it in the museum, which he was very keen on.
He got some space back.
The hangar that it was in, which is also a maintenance hangar, is typical of one of those things that was sort of just shoved in the background, collecting dust and other things. So, it was nice to put it in here and clean it up and have it on display, as an aircraft, indicative of, sort of 1930s flying. They're a beautiful looking aeroplane. Doug series, the series was developed of the WWII. The majority of the series aircraft that were produced from WWII airframes or aircraft that had been, purchased by CAC out of the paddocks here at Tocumwal. So that lineage of, the parent of the series, came from Tocumwal in a paddock up the north here. Is a cool story as well. My bird dog and my Windgill are in here. When we first sort of started getting our guys, I don't really need to tell a story about bird dogs other than I found a tenuous link that the last Oster that got flown into Tocumwal, which was by an army guy who then flew bird dogs in Vietnam. So, there's tenuous links there.
Stretching it.
Stretching it a little bit.
Yeah.
And the Windgill I was trying to find, I figure the Air Force must have landed a Windgill here at some point during the 1950s. And as it turns out, when the Air Force got Windgills and they were operating them up at Uranquinty, they would regularly bring a dozen of them over here for, a week-long, flying camp here just because operations were too busy at Uranquinty. So for nearly 3 years, every couple of weeks there was, a dozen Windgills here operating out of here, which is cool. So that's a less tenuous link. That's a good link for ours. Or as I say, it's my museum. I can do what I want in there.
Play the card.
That's the one. What else have we got in there at the moment? I've got Paul Bennett's T-28 that's here left over from the air show. I've also got his Avenger and Wirraway here at the moment as well. Not in the museum because they won't fit, but they're in my hangar, and we've just got them here temporarily before we head over to Jamestown next weekend for an air show. And I've also got another bird dog in here at the moment, which was a sympathetic providing hangarage to someone who owns a bird dog and needed hangarage. So I'm not going to turn down a bird dog owner who's looking for hangarage because there's not many of us, and we all like to look after each other.
Yeah, you never know when it could be your turn.
Exactly, yeah. So that's what's in here at the moment. We do have, and it does shuffle around very regularly depending on, whose aeroplanes are in here or what's coming and going. That was one of the other things that I wanted to have was kind of a moving feast of aircraft, so that, people who are returning visitors don't just come and see the same thing over and over and over again. And so we do, kind of, part of the philosophy of the museum, sort of coming from my background in the tech industry is, change is constant. So, generally people don't visit museums more than once. So what we wanted to drive was, a reason to come back. So changing content. And the beauty of not being, a massive facility is that it's relatively easy to change content or put, a new exhibit up or shuffle an aeroplane around here and there. And, it's a little bit new again. And so that works quite well. We do have another asset that will be coming into the museum shortly. I'm not sure when this is going to. I'm going to say I'm not sure when this is going to air, but most of the paperwork's already done. But we are the Air Force are gifting us a Mackie, and they've already transported it here and reassembled it and washed it for me, so I assume that's pretty well going to happen.
It's physically on the site. It's a done deal.
Yeah, that's what I figure. It's like they're hardly going to pull it apart and take it away again. But I am not allowed to post anything on Facebook yet until we finally do the deed. But all of the draft paperwork has been done. So, and as I said, they pulled it apart and shipped it here and put it back together again. So it seems unlikely that they'll pull it apart again.
Indications are positive.
Very much so. So it, other than not having an engine, is a complete airframe.
Nice.
It was one of two that were left at Wagga. that were in Air Force care. So basically, it was gifted back from BAE when they transitioned from the Mackies onto the PC9s for ground training. And I just received a phone call out of the blue one day from Dave Gardner, who's the Air Force Collections Manager. He used to be the director down at the RAAF Museum, and I've known for many, many years. And he's sort of sympathetic to to what we're doing here in terms of promoting Air Force history. And that aircraft will go in the display hangar as a gift from Air Force, sort of in recognition of their 18-year service history here. And as we sort of discovered, this was the largest base that the Air Force has ever operated in its 102-year history. But by a long shot, today's large bases like Amberley and Williamtown are still only about 60% of what Tocumwal was at its peak during the war.
Which is it's kind of scary because having been on the base at Amberley, it's huge.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, and it's of all of the stuff that we read and look at and see, it is really surreal to think of all of that stuff happening here at Tocumwal during that period, and the scale of it was just enormous.
Yeah. Hey, just out of interest for our American listeners or people who aren't quite up with some of the aircraft that have been named, Wirraway is very much like the Harvard, shares a common ancestor, late 1930s, 1940s trainer. Windshield was a successor, designed and built in Australia, Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation, big round engine. That's a lovely aircraft in its own unique way. But the series took the Wirraway and converted it into an agricultural plane for spreading fertilizer and such, didn't it?
Yeah, it did, and at the time it was world leading. It could carry a cubic meter or a ton of in its hopper, which no other aircraft on the market at the time could compete with that. But it's the history behind that is very similar to a lot of things that happen in the aviation manufacturing industry, where a really good idea wasn't supported or just didn't have the push to keep it going. And ultimately, only 20 of them were ever built. They're not the most attractive aeroplanes on the face of the earth, but most agricultural aeroplanes aren't. But it's historically very significant, and we are very fortunate to have Doug's aircraft here.
There's very few of them left now, isn't there?
Yeah, there's only 3 airframes left.
One of them's in
New Zealand. Yeah.
And one's at the Moorabbin Air Museum, and they ran the engine a few years ago.
Yeah. So Doug's is technically airworthy. Again, it doesn't have a current maintenance release, but it did fly here. And as subtly as you do things, we're trying to encourage Doug to get its MR released again, so that we can, some of us, I'd love to have a fly of it. I think it'd be really curious to fly it. Having spent a fair bit of time in the Wirraway now, it'd be interesting to compare them in terms of how they perform. But also just it's a very rare piece of Australian aviation history, and it'd be be a real privilege to be able to fly something like that. So.
For sure.
Yeah. You were talking about having ways of getting people to come back if they've visited once before, and of course one of those ways is your air show. Tell us about that.
So the air show air shows to us are obviously pretty common. I've been flying in displays since probably 12 or 13 years now, and the thing that I love about air shows, and I'm still very passionate about them, is that they engage the average person.
Yes.
That's there's not 5,500 aviation enthusiasts that come to an air show. Like our air show, it's 5,500 mums, dads, kids, grandma and grandpa, who are still enthralled and inspired and by aviation, and I love the fact that aviation can still do that. That people still ooh and ah and gasp at what goes on at an air show, because aviation in a lot of respects has become very sterile and boring. If you go on an airline, that's exactly what they are, sterile and boring, which is what you want them to be. But as a result, they're not very inspiring. And so a way to inspire, the next generation of aviators, whether they're flyers or maintainers or engineers or whatever, is to expose them to something that they don't normally get to see or experience. And an air show does that. Back in the days when we were all kids, we used to go to air shows and hang around airports, and there was no fences, no security, and you could go and talk to people, and you could go in cockpits and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Today, the kids don't get to experience any of that sort of stuff unless they happen to know a pilot. And the thing I love about the air shows is, kids get to experience that stuff, close up. They get to see the aircraft flying, which is another thing that I love is, cool old airplanes sitting in a hangar is cool, but getting them out and flying them and seeing what they look like when they're flying, how they perform, what they sound like, that's all of the sensory stuff that I love about it. And so it's good to be able to, to run the air show and deliver that. So we've run 3 here now at Tocumwal. The first one we ran back in 2019, which was kind of a part of the planning for the museum was for us to be known within the community. As I said, we were very new to town and no one really knew us that much. And I wanted to sort of be able to kind of make a statement to say, well, if we say we're going to do something, we're going to deliver it. So we, in a very short period of time, cobbled together an air show. It was very successful. I think we had about 4,500 people to the first one, which is, a big thing for a town of 2,000 people.
Yeah.
It really good flying display. It was all the things that we want, which is, fascinating for all the people who attended. Dragged people from all over the place to visit not only the town, but, give us some kudos so that when we sort of started working on the museum project, we weren't just, Matt and Kaz, these people from out of towners coming in and doing something. It was, oh, look, they put on this major event. It's the largest, sort of family friendly event in the entire Shire and region. So, it's sort of given us, respect and connections and the ability to be able to do things that we wouldn't have otherwise been able to do, I don't think.
Right. Well, that's awesome.
Cool.
And you said you've had 3. The most recent one was just a few weeks ago, wasn't it?
Yeah, weekend before last, yeah. So it was held in typical spring Tocumwal weather. It was 25 degrees, clear blue skies, a light northerly, which is what I'd predicted 6 months earlier. And which is, ironically, exactly the same weather that we had for the previous 2 shows.
Right.
And, we had a really good flying program. It basically is just, the flying side of things for me, for our show, we try and make it as like a big social event for all of our mates who do air show flying. So it's a pretty casual kind of laid back event, which, we want to maintain it as that. I don't have plans to get, bigger and better and boomier and all these other bits and pieces. If we can continue to get 5,500 people and all of those who are, participating, come and have a good time, like that's good enough. We don't need to be, bigger and Ben-Hur or make things more complicated than they need to be. It does what we want to do, which is to, extend the museum out into the airfield and into the air, and sort of showcase as much of, our aviation history and heritage as we can, in the skies over Tocumwal, which again just sort of, continues that message to all the people who attend. Ando, who does all the commentary, is brilliant at sort of helping tell that story. Which the people who come, a lot of what they comment on is that they go away not having had a good experience and it's a good spectacle, but they also will go away learning stuff. So for people who might not come through the museum and read everything, they can go out to the airfield and watch airplanes fly around all day and eat some nice food from a food truck and play in a simulator but also, get educated about our history without having to come in here and do it.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, fantastic. It sounds like everything's going well there anyway, and I'm really pleased. Anyone starting a new museum, it's always going to be an uphill battle, and in a big task in the modern world. So I'm really glad that your museum sounds to be really really good, really successful. So well
Yeah,
done.
and I think the model is very different. So we're not a charity or a not-for-profit or a committee or anything else like that. So Kaz and I own this. It's our private business.
Yeah.
It's our private investment that's put all of this together. another element of the returning customer is obviously the cafe that we've got here as well,
Yep.
and that was a critical part of the business model, to encourage repeat custom, and make the whole venture viable. Was knowing that some days you just don't get anyone through the museum, but my principles were we're going to be open every day, and we're going to be open 10 till 4. And because tourists come every day. Toke's a big tourist town. It's on a major tourist path. And if you're not open, then people will just keep driving. And
True.
so that was part of the big principle for us was, the museum has to be open every day. And a way to support that was to have, a commercially viable business attached to it, or integrated within it, that would, kind of stand alone in its own right, but also ensure that the museum was open every day.
You said that it's a tourist town. I looked it up and did see something about it being the Murray River region. Is that why people go there? Is it
Yeah,
because
so
of the
for the river. So the Murray River is obviously very iconic in Australia, and part of the the development concepts with council originally were, council would, like every other council, in a drought time, which is kind of when we sort of started all of this, were, trying to diversify away from farming and that in terms of having, employment opportunities and economic opportunities that weren't dependent on farming. And tourism's obviously, a key part of that. And for me, being from an industry where differentiating is a big thing. It's all, tech industry is all about differentiating yourself and being, being the wanted technology. For me, it was, the council had been like, pushing this, we're a river town. I was like, yeah, but there's like 300 river towns. Every town on the river can claim to be a river town.
yeah
What makes us different and special and unique? And, our aviation heritage here, and particularly wartime heritage here is absolutely unique and significant. Nowhere else in Australia had what happened here. And so it finally sort of dawned on everyone that, yes, we're a river town, but the thing that makes Tocumwal special and unique and different is our aviation heritage, and our wartime heritage. But yeah, we've got 36 whole PGA golf course, which is on land that used to be part of the aerodrome. The Murray River from here is about 1 kilometre away. It's on the Newell Highway, which is one of the two major road systems north, other than the Hume Highway. So it is a kind of a gateway, for the Victorians heading north and people heading into Victoria. So for a town of just over 2,000 people, it gets in the order of about 100,000 tourists a year.
oh wow gosh
Camping on the river is a huge thing.
Yep.
There's caravan parks around here that have got licenses for 5,000 people, and they're just over the river. So during long weekends, like at the moment, we've got AFL Grand Final. So today's a public holiday for Victorians. Monday's a public holiday for New South Wales people. So town's packed with campers this weekend and holiday makers who ski on the river, boat on the river, fish on the river, camp by the river. And so, part of our philosophy was, we didn't have to try and get people to Tocumwal. All we had to do was capture them while they're here for a little while. And that was sort of part of the methodology, was going, well, yeah, we don't have to try and get 100,000 people to Tocumwal a year. All we have to do is, if there's 100,000 people coming, grab 10 or 15% of them while we're here. And that sort of works that way, where we've been able to achieve that, which is really good.
So for listeners to this here in New Zealand or in the States or overseas, what's the easiest way to come and visit your museum? Do we fly into Sydney or
No, Melbourne actually. So we're we're only a 3-hour drive from Melbourne Airport. If you basically head out of Melbourne and go straight north, you hit Tocumwal. And and we do get a lot of international visitors. A lot of people travel, who are driving in country areas or traveling around northern Victoria. Particularly, post COVID, we've had a lot more of that, which has been good. 3-hour drive, north of Melbourne. Sydney, Sydney from here is about 7 hours. So even though we're in New South Wales, we're closer to Victoria.
It's a big state.
It's a very big state, yeah.
Yeah, I kind of remember that from when we drove around it.
Yeah, well, when Kit and I in the before times would take a balloon up to Leeton to fly up near Narandra, Toke was where we would stop for lunch, or breakfast as it was, because we'd leave at stupid o'clock in the morning. And now that we know that the cafe is open, if we're doing it again, definitely drop by the cafe.
Yeah, it's becoming the cafe's become an attraction in its own right. Which we didn't really expect, but it does make doing what we do here, much more viable. Interesting to note that Temora are now integrating a cafe into their museum. So has the museum at Scone. And sometime in the future, the Air Force will cat on that maybe you want to feed people when they're at Point Cook.
Yeah, well, it's getting into Point Cook that's some of the fun. I think it's because I've got a defence ID that they picked me for vehicle inspections.
Yeah, and that's one of the challenges with operating at Point Cook, and it has been since back in September 2001. But it's even more difficult now than it used to be to get in, because they're having to book early and all that other stuff. But we don't have any of those challenges, thankfully. People can just drive in and come and visit.
Or better yet, fly in.
Or fly in. We get a lot of people flying in. Again, that's one of the other attractions for the cafes, is people flying in for a coffee or lunch. We're only, for most light aircraft, about an hour from Melbourne, from around the Melbourne basin, and so we get lots of people who fly up on a nice day just to come up and have lunch and then fly home again. Good excuse to go for a fly is to go and have something to eat. So.
Yeah.
Yep.
Have you got another air show planned for next year, or?
No. So the original plan was always to do them biannually. So 2 years is kind of often enough. It gives you enough time to forget how much hard work they are.
Yeah.
It's like having kids.
I was having the exact same conversation with someone this morning. It's we don't have kids, but it seems like as much hard work. And the risk reward's probably about the same, I imagine. It's, and the other thing is, obviously the Australian Airshow calendar is tightly confined into two couple of month periods at the start of the end of the year, and there's already a lot of established air shows that are trying to get back to normal scheduling after all of the COVID kerfuffle. And from a display pilot's perspective, there's only so many of us, and there's only so many weekend passes you can get. So, trying to run all of these shows every year would be impossible. You just wouldn't be able to get the people to do it. So, so most of the shows here are biannually, just simply because of the the resourcing to do it, and you just couldn't do them every year because there just wouldn't be enough pilots or aircraft to do them.
Right. Yeah. Oh, well, thank you very much, Matt. It's been fascinating to chat about all your activities.
Oh, my pleasure. It's it's good to chat with you guys, and I get to catch up with Grant reasonably regularly at air shows here and there, which is nice. Yeah, it's been a while since we've caught up in person, Dave, but I'm sure that'll happen again one day soon.
Yeah. I think last time was at Omaka, wasn't it?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's that's another air show I want to get back to.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, you should. Are you coming over for any others coming up, like WARBIRD or anything like that?
Oh no, it's the challenge of running a business 7 days a week is it's very hard for me to get a leave pass, and so and that's kind of part of the challenge now is when I want to go somewhere, it means that other people here have to cover my bum. So and unfortunately we've got a really good team of staff here who make that work. So for like next weekend when I'm away in Jamestown, there's people here who can cover me and do my job while I'm not here, which is really nice. But it's something I haven't had to really consider before, because my previous role I was very flexible in where I could work, whereas now I'm not so flexible with where I work. I just keep telling Kaz that anytime I go to an air show, it's marketing and promotion for our museum, and that doesn't really get carried away that much. So. I'll keep saying it though.
One day it'll work.
Yeah, probably not.
Yeah, cool. Well, thanks again.
My pleasure. Thanks, guys. We'll chat soon.
Cool.
Thanks, Matt.
Reminding you that radio engines don't leak oil. They just mark their territory. This is WARBIRD Radio. Tune in. Take off.